Hello, and welcome to another episode in our AAUA 2026 podcast series, in which we speak to leaders across the country on current issues facing higher education. Based upon the theme for our annual meeting, October 19 through 20 at Cleveland State University, we're focused on realizing the higher education value proposition. I'm Sandra Affenito, our president and CEO of the American Association of University Administrators. AAUA is a nonprofit professional organization for higher education leaders and administrative personnel. It is the only professional organization for individuals who are deeply interested in the entire range of higher education administration, from entry level to president, across our diverse set of both colleges and universities in the nation. One area of research and scholarly work that is not given nearly enough attention is how an institution focuses on employee engagement, support of employees, their well-being, and creating value that far exceeds traditional institutional success measures and metrics. To explore this topic in greater depth, it's a great pleasure to be joined today by Dr. Kevin McClure, Distinguished Professor of College Leadership and Organizational Change at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. With over 15 years in higher education across faculty and staff roles in student and academic affairs, Dr. McClure is the author of The Caring University, Reimagining the Higher Education Workplace After the Great Resignation. So a warm welcome to our program and to Kevin.
Thank you so much. It is a great honor to be here and to have a wonderful conversation with colleagues that I greatly admire, and I hope that I can contribute to the conversations in the run-up to your convening.
Thank you, Kevin. We're delighted. We're thrilled you're with us today. And at this point, I'm going to turn the microphone right over to our AAUA board member, Dr. Tim Jansa, who will delve into Kevin's work and how it can create value to entire campus communities. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Sandra. I really appreciate the introduction, and welcome again, Kevin. So, Kevin, I'd like to start our conversation with somewhat of a bold statement and a subsequent question that I've actually asked another guest on the program, and that is that most higher ed institutions, despite being in the business of learning, are rarely true learning organizations. So how does taking greater care of employees and improving the employee experience in higher ed, and not just for faculty, but also for staff, actually change this paradigm?
That's a great question. I think your observation is astute and accurate. Interestingly, I think we have all of the ingredients to be phenomenal learning organizations. So there's amazing potential for us if we're willing to, as you put it boldly, step into that challenge. What's interesting is that is both an outcome and, I think, an important precursor to being able to better support the well-being of our employees. And what I mean by that is, in many respects, the ability for us to better show up for and attend to the well-being of our employees requires some front-end learning first in a couple of ways. One is, I think there needs to be a mindset shift, or in some cases, a mindset reaffirmation that happens amongst those of us that have stepped into leadership roles. And the reason for that is that we've certainly got people who are already dialed into this and are thinking really intentionally about employee well-being. But the truth is that there are a number of us that were socialized through higher education in such a way where the employee experience was just not a priority. It doesn't mean that people were intentionally cruel or were cutthroat and attempting to undermine people's well-being. It's just, it was sometimes neglected as we are pursuing other priorities. And so this mindset shift is in many ways to recenter the importance of the employee experience. The other layer of this that's really important, I think, is many institutions still have a very rudimentary at best understanding of who their employees are and what their experience is on the job. And I know that this will sound like I'm taking an extreme position, but the truth is that there are many institutions where if you're to ask them basic questions about their employees, they struggle to answer them. So I'm talking about how many employees do you have? If we were to try to understand the demographic breakdown of employees in different groups, some of this is a pure technical or logistical challenge in the sense that there are different data sets that not everybody has access to. They're not always speaking to one another. So there's some basic, even just directory information about our employees that we can struggle to be able to answer accurately. But then beyond that, we often rely very heavily on exit interviews. And there's some great research showing that our implementation or our practice around exit interviews leaves something to be desired, or on engagement surveys that may be deployed episodically. And engagement surveys can be really helpful, but what I find is they have a tendency to level out and mute real insight into the employee experience. So it's possible for all of our institutions to look at our engagement data and to say, you know what, we're doing okay. And to not really know kind of what to do with that data. All right. So that's kind of some precursor challenges where there's a real opportunity there to learn more about our employees, what their experience is, as a way of informing how to better show up for them. And then once we implement some of these changes, we turn this into a routine of campus life. I think what we'll find is that we are better positioned to continue that learning process. And I'm really in favor of thinking about this as an ongoing cyclical process where we are asking questions, we're shifting our leaders' mindsets, we are collecting information, we're maybe engaging in some collective sense making on our campuses, and then identifying one commitment that we can make to improve the employee experience, and then repeating that process. And in that way, embodying, I think, a better model of institutional learning.
To be honest, Kevin, I had to chuckle a little bit when you mentioned employee engagement surveys and employee and staff climate surveys and so forth. I think we all have been through many of them. And what always puzzles me is how leaders still rely on them, even if they only may have had like a 15 or 20% response rate. And then it's mostly numerical metrics. They don't really truly understand the experience, which is by and large not a quantitative but a qualitative metric, right? So I think there's a lot more. And the other thing that struck me in what you just said is that knowing your employees is such a fundamental concept of leadership these days, right? So leaders not knowing, or the administration not really truly having a grasp on who the people are who are working on their campuses, I think that is actually puzzling, right, to some extent.
I think one of the big challenges is we often have quite fragmented organizations. That depends a little bit on your institutional context for sure, but I have visited and have studied at and worked at places that are quite big, and where that notion of a divide between this department and another department across campus is very real. That notion of a divide between academic affairs or student affairs is quite real. And the consequence of that is it can be really difficult to, first of all, have the institution kind of rowing in a similar direction. You might have one part of campus that's like really on board with this and they're moving with it, and another part that is for various reasons lagging. And so you're trying to figure out, how do we enable the momentum happening over here while trying to get these folks over here caught up a little bit? Of course, because of that, you've got some real resource disparities between units that might affect how they can invest or the types of initiatives they're able to resource. And so there are even at my own institution, some academic colleges that just frankly have more staff capacity because they have a different level of resourcing. And so that affects the workplace experience of people. And so we will see that, I think, show up in the data from time to time, where you really have to be able to disaggregate based on different types of positions and functional areas, because yes, we may all work at the same institution, but our realities and our conditions can be quite different as a result of that. So you have to be able to be comfortable with that kind of complexity, and to say there are going to be relatively few solutions that just across the board we're going to be able to enact that are adapted to the context of a specific unit and are going to address the unique needs that they have. And similarly, be comfortable with the fact that some of this work may not happen in the form of sweeping institutional initiatives. So I think that's a big challenge that many of our institutions struggle with, is that fragmentation. And the other one that I'll mention really quickly that I've become more experienced with as a department chair in my first year, as I think about implementing some of this. I suppose I'm entering my second year, so I've got a little more experience under my belt. But the truth is that, and you all, I think, will appreciate that, this given your own experiences, change implementation is its own craft. Mm-hmm. It is one thing for me as an academic to say, this is what I think we should do, and this is the change that I think is necessary. And the other to design a change process that brings these ideas to fruition. And I think we would be kidding ourselves if we imagine that we can just kind of snap our fingers and magically these things happen. The reality is that someone has to sit down and map out, what does this change look like? Is this going to be in the form of a committee? Is this going to be in the form of a new policy change? Are we going to pilot it in some way? And this gets into the nitty gritty of what change looks like, but that's real life. And I think the real life part of this is truthfully a challenge.
Well, and then considering we have so many institutions in this country, we have over 4,000 institutions, each and every one is different. So while your ideas and your scholarship is just absolutely stunning, to be honest, I think is very much needed, the implementation, of course, depends very much on the institutional context, on the leadership, on their mindsets, on their attitude toward, and willingness, quite frankly, to actually break through these silos and create the kind of circumstances and the kind of culture that is required in order to be able to put these ideas in these changes into action.
I think that as we move forward as the Academy of Higher Ed, it all boils down to what you originally mentioned. Knowing your employees, obviously, taking the time to break down the silos, taking the time to disaggregate the data. But more importantly, when you do lead the change, it all starts with knowing that the most valuable resources are human resources. And when you build that trust and you understand your people, your community, internally, externally, it makes it happen. And I think, Tim, as you address this, it's so customized based on each institution, the culture, the resources, the type of institution. But at the end of the day, we're people. And as people first leaders, that's what we do. And I want to just say one other point that comes to mind as we reflect upon this. In today's academy, there's a lot of remote workers. So as we think about that, we also have to be all in with them as well. And I know there's all modalities now, but that's so mission critical in terms of not only walking the campus, being with your people, but making sure we embrace those remote employees.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to your point, Sandra, sometimes I chuckle at the notion of people-centered leadership, because in my mind, all leadership is people-centered. There is no leadership in the absence of people. That's the job.
Right.
But there is a certain disposition and set of skills that I think can come with that. And And it is true that we've got some very different campuses, very different subcultures within campuses that may need different types of change leadership. But there are, I think, even in the midst of all of that diversity, some principles around how to approach change that are pretty universal. And part of this work, in my mind, is not just about designing a beautiful strategic plan or coming up with the perfectly designed policy. It's really about how do I shepherd change in such a way that people have an opportunity to grow along with it. Because that's the only way that culture is going to fully change. Certainly, the structural change is important in the form of a handbook or a new contract, but if we want to see some of that cultural change, it means that we have to help people better understand the norms at play and then reflect upon them and think about new ways of doing things.
So Kevin, since we're talking about change, there's like two things I wanted to ask you about. And I want to get to the tempered radicals. I think we're going to get there second, because that's a concept that you write about, and I'm truly intrigued by, because those are very much change makers and change catalysts. But we've been talking a little bit about mental mindset shifts, mental models. You also talk about mindset reaffirmation. And when we talk about interrogating these mental models, what are some assumptions that a lot of higher ed leaders today hold about work performance, loyalty, and so forth that don't really serve our institutions anymore? And then what can they do in order to surface and question those assumptions and actually start that realization that change is needed, and also devise some kind of practical steps in order to implement and strategize for that change?
Love this question. Love this question. I think one mental model that has some basis in truth, but nevertheless is one that's worth questioning, is the idea that we always have a flood of people interested in working in higher education and applying for a given job. And the reason why I think that this is rooted in some truth is that we do have positions where we could, let's say, have somebody leave and to say this position is untenable, and we could repost it with 0 changes and still see highly qualified applicants interested in it. And that's a type of signal to us that maybe we don't need to change anything because we've got people who are interested. And then obviously we've got a situation faculty-wise where typically our supply far outstrips demand. And similarly, that can send a signal to us that we don't need to change anything. However, I do think that there are good reasons why we should ask some questions around that. One is that we all know of positions where it's frankly harder to hire, and where it's never been the case that we could just post this position and expect that we're going to get the types of applicants that we want. I have noticed, for example, that we are seeing search consultants being engaged for positions that are further down the organizational hierarchy, because it's getting harder, I think, to be able to recruit highly qualified, talented people into some of those positions that are so crucial. And it's not a great approach to talent management to simply say, I think forever and ever, we're just going to be able to magically attract people. And we need to be thinking a little bit more proactively, especially given that in a given geography, our competition can be quite stiff. If you've got a great marketing and communications professional, they could work at a dozen different organizations in an area. And so there's reason why I think we should interrogate that complacency a little bit. So that's one mental model that I think is worth giving a little bit of reflection to. Another one that I think happens to many of us is kind of a mental shortcut, which is we have these positional categories: faculty, staff, administrator, and we place people in those categories and then sometimes make assumptions about them. And we say faculty are this and administrators are that, and this is what their motives are. And And this is true of faculty. As a faculty member, I can own this. We engage in that type of categorization, and it doesn't allow us to understand the work that people do. It doesn't allow us, in some cases, to get to know them fully. Sometimes we're just plain wrong about what their motivations are and why they've been called to the work that they do. And so I would love for us to be a little bit more comfortable realizing the fuzziness of many of our positions. I still feel like a faculty member, but I'm in a leadership position now. I think there are many people who occupy a kind of dual space. We've got staff who are in the classroom, staff who are doing research. And so there's reason for us, I think, to just get a little bit more comfortable with that nuance and complexity of the work that people do. And that will enable us to get to know each other a little bit better, because those assumptions, I think, can lead to conflict between faculty and administrators, for example, that is not particularly productive. And it's rooted in an assumption as opposed to really understanding who somebody is and what they're all about. If I were to name, one final mental model, it might be, or that is worth giving some additional thought to, it might be this notion of where our responsibility lies as an organization and as an employer for the employee experience and employee well-being. There are, I think, limits to this, and that's totally reasonable. It is not the case that an employer should be responsible for every facet of an individual's well-being. That said, I think our institutions could take a little bit more responsibility. We have, in some cases, some might argue, we have gone overboard in assuming responsibility for the well-being of our students in certain ways, right? I'm not saying that we should jettison the student success movement. I'm all for it. However, we really have embraced this. And there are moments where that has come at the expense of employees. And so we have this legal duty of care to students at the moment that they matriculate. And it is a basic legal expectation. I think it would be to our benefit to reflect on in what ways are we responding to that responsibility for the people that we hire.
Kevin, I wanted to get back to to those tempered radicals. Number one, I love the term. And number two, we talked so much about change and implementing change. How do these tempered radicals, those are people who push for change within the existing systems, what does that actually look like in practical terms? And especially for leaders who need to empower those people rather than sideline them as disruptors. What have you seen? Where has this worked, and how has it worked?
Yeah, so the notion of tempered radicals is that within any given organization, you likely have some people who are quite adept at pushing, not necessarily in a revolutionary way in the sense of we're throwing the papers up in the air and walking out, but rather working within existing systems, but being discontent with the status quo and saying, I'm going to use my knowledge to help us make progress, even if it brings some discomfort, and even if it means that I have to assume a little bit of personal risk in doing that. Within any given college or university, I think we have people who would fit that kind of definition. And there are a couple things I'll say about tempered radicals. One is that I think it's incredibly healthy to have these people within an organization. It is good to have some people who are willing to push from time to time. Our systems are very good at replication and reproduction and minimizing turbulence. Some would say that systems design a culture that preserves the system. And what that means is that anytime people are going to step out a little bit, they can be ostracized, they can be punished, they may be passed over for promotion. So I do want to say that as much as tempered radical sounds like it can be a favorable thing, there are some folks who say that's me, and I have also taken on some of this risk and these responsibilities, and it has not always been to my benefit. Here's a really concrete example of this. There are people who are tasked with leading general education reform on their campuses. And it is very difficult for this to not be a lightning rod position. I'm not saying all of these folks are tempered radicals, but let's say they're walking into this and they've got some trust capital that they built up because they're long-term faculty. In my experience, 80% of them are women, and they take on a heightened level of risk by virtue of that type of change process. And it can bring all sorts of attention. It can bring all sorts of organizational frustration and toxicity forward. And so they might say, yes, I am a tempered radical. I'm attempting to push us in this direction. But there are some costs to me personally that come from that type of labor on campus. For leaders, I have been in the presence of leaders that I really appreciate, because they know who the tempered radicals are.
Yes.
They could name who they are on your campus, but when you talk to them and you talk to them privately, they will always say, we have incredible faculty here. And even if they're frustrated, even if that's somewhat of a conceit, what I appreciate about it is they are stepping into their leadership in a way that suggests that they don't see their job as a battle with these resistors, but rather say the resistors are part of this organization and part of what keeps us honest. I get nervous about places where I see a new leader come in and it's like we're cleaning house. Now, listen, I've never been in that position. There are likely instances in which there's a logic to that. But I think it can be good for a leader to come in and say, this is a person who's going to challenge me. And for a period of time, at least, I think that's going to be a good thing. And we need that, as opposed to me kind of bringing in a full team of people who I know are just going to say yes to some of these things. That's a bit of a meandering response, but to say that I think there's a type of organizational health that can come from having people who are pushing a little bit. But the question for us, I think, becomes, are we supporting that and making space for it? And that's hard to do. That's hard to do for sure. But I think we might be able to see some of those folks as sources of innovation and not necessarily as thorns in our side.
I'm so glad you mentioned psychological safety, because that's another word that I just that I wanted to home in on. The other one is, Kevin, something you and I talked about last time we spoke, and that's the willingness and ability of leaders to operate in a space of discomfort. And I think this is something that a lot of leaders just are not happy with, especially those who come from the faculty. I mean, they're used to being the smartest person in the room, subject matter experts, right? And so they move into leadership positions, and all of a sudden they are in a space where they will eventually be uncomfortable with what is happening around them, because they may not fully grasp what is happening from a leadership perspective. But also with the complexity, there are a lot of people, different interests that come at them, and to navigate through that, I think that is something that, in addition to psychological safety, also is something maybe where we can do a better job in terms of leadership development for leaders on campus, where we train them in, number one, providing psychological safety, providing and living by certain values that will allow for employee growth and engagement, and the space for them to speak up and to criticize the status quo, and and then be comfortable with discomfort.
Yeah, I think, one of the realities is, particularly for senior leaders, the pressures on them are enormous. And by virtue of those pressures, I think there is an expectation that people come in and they have answers. Mm-hmm. They have solutions. They have a direction that is going to guide this institution to stability and success. One potentially negative byproduct of those pressures and those types of expectations is it makes it hard for a leader to, in some cases, demonstrate intellectual humility, where they may come in and say, I don't have the answers. I am learning. I appreciate your questions, and I hope that we can find answers to those. And oh, by the way, this success that we've achieved, I want to credit our CFO or our advancement officer, who's really the person who originated this idea. And so, again, a big thing for me, by the way, is I believe that we very often have very good people who have stepped into leadership roles, and I'm grateful that they've done so. But those pressures and those expectations, I think, can create so little space for those types of dispositions to come forward. Even if there's something that a leader says, this is something I'd like to do, I'm struggling to be able to fully demonstrate that, because there is, speaking of risk, a certain type of professional risk that can come from that. There are people in institutions and boards, I think, that are more amenable to that than others. And truth be told, I don't know that all faculty, for example, would love the idea of a senior leader coming in and saying, I don't have all the answers. They might be really receptive to it, but some might say, well, then what are we paying you XYZ for? You should have some answers, right? And so in many cases, the environment and the ecosystem that we've created for leadership have resulted in some of the leadership things that we complain about routinely, which means that for me, a good reflection point is we need to be thinking differently about that environment and expectations, to your point, how we develop people and prepare them for leadership positions and what we reward. Too often, I think the reward or the way that we're evaluating people, especially in those senior leadership positions, is very much still premised on a set of success metrics that have very little to do with how you have led people, how you've shepherded processes, how you've created cultures of trust, how you've created psychological safety. And so, some of this requires a little bit of reorientation, even at the board level or at the level of senior leadership, around what success looks like. But for me, there's 10 actions of carrying leadership. I'm not going to go into all of these, but I just want to underscore that intellectual humility is one of them, and a really important one, and has been fundamental to me in my very short walk as a department chair, because, and in many cases is easy and genuine because there are so many things I don't know, but I actually think there's a lot of power into saying, I don't have all of the answers. I'd love for us to work on answers together to some of these really important questions. And thank you for raising these questions. I think these are valid concerns. This will help us sharpen what we're working on. And that I'm not doing this alone. I've got a great team of people that are working on this together, and I'm grateful for their contributions.
And I think it's a much more, let's say, contemporary concept of leadership as well. I mean, you and I have talked a little bit about evolutionary organizations. I'm thinking specifically, about the work of Frédéric Laloux, for example. We're not going to go into detail here. I think that's definitely a topic for another conversation. But what goes hand in hand with that is this type of leadership. I recently had the opportunity to actually teach a couple of leadership classes in Ukraine, and it was funny how the concept in different parts of the world with regard to leadership, management, competence, having answers or not having answers, intellectual humility, those kind of things, there's a very, very different attitude toward those. And it's really fascinating to see how those differ. And quite frankly, though, how I think our institutions could definitely benefit more from the type of leadership and intellectual humility, and more like a servant leadership mindset, and admitting that you don't have all the answers would definitely benefit. So, Kevin, I wanted to kind of move on just a little bit. As you know, the topic for our conference is realizing the higher ed value proposition. And I would love to talk a little bit about value. Now, I know in your work, you distinguish between the broader value of higher education and then also the employee value proposition. And I'm wondering if you were to explain to a parent, maybe to somebody who's out there, skeptical community member, a politician who might think that higher ed is no longer relevant, doesn't really bring much value beyond perhaps getting a student a job at a certain salary level. What would you say to them? How would you explain the value of higher ed, and especially integrating the employee value proposition there as well?
I have a lot of thoughts in response to this. I'm going to like throw them out there and see if there's some thread that brings them together. The first is somewhat of a hot take. I have gone on the record as saying this. I think in higher ed, we have gone overboard in our concern for the public perception of higher education, which isn't to say we should ignore public perception, but the reality is that people are sometimes wrong and they have opinions, and I grant them their opinions. But if those opinions are not rooted in direct experience, they're not rooted in reality, they're rooted in media snippets, I don't know that we ought to be completely changing what we do in response to that. Another piece of it is that for me, too much of the value conversation is filtered into economic return on investment. Again, my point is not to suggest that we ignore that entirely, because it is important, and not to downplay it. However, prior to the work that we're discussing now, I did a lot of work on regional public universities and worked with the American Association of State Colleges and Universities and my colleague Cecilia Orphan on a series of reports on stewardship of place. And those reports help us to understand the absolutely fundamental community value of our institutions. They don't always live up to that promise, but it doesn't mean that we cannot. The problem by filtering everything into that narrow economic return on investment is that we do not account for the numerous ways in which our institutions are vital to communities and contributing to communities. And therefore, it's very likely to justify lower investment in them. And so my understanding of value in that way is very broad and tries to capture the totality of what our institutions are and what they contribute. And then the last piece, I think, again, I tend to these days think a little bit more about that notion of like, what's the value proposition of working in higher education? And so that's a little bit different than the value proposition more broadly to, for example, a student thinking about coming. But there's a relationship between the two. The employee value proposition is very much focused on what do we do as an institution that makes this place worth working at and makes it worth someone contributing their scarce time and brilliance. And that's going to look a little different from campus to campus because different campuses are going to have different strengths. But when we are able to invest in that employee value proposition, it has downstream effects for our students. It only increases the value proposition for them. I don't think it's coincidental that there is a strong relationship between places that have a clear invested in employee proposition and places that have really strong student outcomes. And when you've got a place that is struggling to attract people, struggling to keep people, we're going to see that show up in what students report about their time there. I visit some of these places that I think are doing really innovative work around employee well-being. They might be a division of student affairs that are just kind of knocking it out of the park. They are also typically leaders in the field around what good student affairs looks like. And so I think that that relationship is one that's worth keeping in mind in this value conversation, because I think in some cases we are making moves where we're trying to improve upon the value proposition for students that are not premised in strengthening our organizations. They're premised in how do we move students through programs faster in areas where we think that they're going to get paid well. I don't know that it strengthens the institution in the long term. And I pose that as a genuine question, not necessarily even like I have a real answer to that, but I think it's worth us giving some thought to. I'm much more personally in the business of building up institutions, making them more functional, making them operate better. And I think that's how you build trust. I don't think it's about external projection. I think it's about how we better function internally, and then we get better outcomes that it plants the seeds for trust.
So this is a final question for you. At AAUA, we pride ourselves on being cross-functional, and it really speaks to everything that you and Tim have outlined for us. So one of the major things that we have to think about and contemplate as leaders who value our employees, our students, and bring them together through the mission. What is, Kevin, your vision for the future of higher ed? And how do our institutions need to change to live up to their fullest potential, to be actualized?
$1 million question, right? What's my
Billion-dollar
vision?
question, Kevin.
Billion-dollar question. What I might do is I'm gonna size this down just a little bit, and I'm gonna try to articulate what I think of as a caring university, which is for me in many cases aspirational, because there is no place that is getting it entirely right, that is knocking it out of the park. They've checked all the boxes. They've got the badge. They are the caring university. I like to joke that as soon as I have found an example at an institution that I want to highlight, the next day there's something in the news about an item that they're struggling with. And that's the reality of campus life, right? You can have a place that's doing something really innovative in one domain, but also there's a strike that's about to happen in another. And so for me, my grand vision is that we have institutions that are trying to do more things for the people who are employed there. When I say trying to do things, I mean taking a few more swings. One of the things that I find disheartening in this conversation is if I were to try to kind of put a leader on the hot seat and I were to say, name for me what you have done for employees in the last year or 2 years, they struggle. They might be able to tell you a dozen things that they have done for students, but they can't really name anything that they've done differently for the employee experience. And so in many cases, this is work that's about trying a few things. I mentioned that for me, it's really based on the theory of small wins. So Carl Weck wrote about the theory of small wins. And I think that's, for me as a pragmatist, the truth of what this looks like. I love the potential for institutions spiraling in a positive way. In community development, there is a theory of community capital, where if we invest in multiple domains, what we see is communities that spiral up as opposed to spiral down. And if I can be in some small way part of helping us to spiral up with making one commitment, following it up with another commitment, and continuing to make this a routine part of campus life, I think that will make for a brighter future for those of us that are committed to this work in our institutions for the long term. And that's a brighter future for me. Again, it's not about perfection. It's never going to happen. Our institutions are not going to be perfect. It's about progress. And if I can get a few more institutions to commit to progress, that for me is a better version of the future of higher ed.
Beautifully said, Kevin. Thank you so very much. Listen, Sandra and I really can't thank you enough for your time, for your leadership, for your scholarship. over the years on a really crucial topic that I think higher ed leaders are finally seem to be taken a little more seriously. And the employee experience and just creating greater value for the entire campus community, especially through taking care of our employees. This is definitely a topic that we're going to be exploring also at the AAUA conference at Cleveland State University in October. So thank you again, Kevin. I really appreciate it. And a big tip of my hat also goes to my wonderful co-host, Sandra Affenito.
Well, I could talk for days. So we're getting you back for part 2 of a series. That would be awesome. Your mission is our mission at AAUA. It's all about the human elements, the people, the leadership development, all we do to embrace that community of leaders and learners from the bottom of our heart at AAUA. I can't thank you both enough.
Just wanted to say this has been fantastic. I could also go for days. And so I think I'm grateful to be part of this small but mighty community and hope that we can continue the conversation.
Excellent, Kevin. We look forward to it. And for everybody watching and listening, we will continue to have an exciting lineup of guests planned over the next few months, including many who will be speaking and presenting at our national conference in October at Cleveland State University. So please stay tuned for the announcement of those upcoming episodes. And in the meantime, please visit AAUA.org to check out the podcast and, more importantly even, to register and then attend our national conference again in October 19th and 20th at Cleveland State University. Until then, take care and see you soon. Thanks so much.